and Ben have been working for a consulting company called E3 in San Francisco for a number of years, and they finally got fed up, especially Ben, I think, so they've set up their own company now. They've broken off on their own, and as of January, now they're just looking for work. And
that sounds way more desperate than I know we are right now. Thank you. Always.
I'm sure they'll recover. But they've also been doing some neat stuff. Ben is the head of the U.S. Deep Decarbonization Project, and his mentor, Jim, their mentor in their new company, is head of the World Deep Decarbonization Project. So pretty neat stuff. And they've recruited Ryan to do coding for the Deep Decarbonization Project software, and that's about all I know. So I'm going to turn it over. One other thing. Rock recently formed a clean energy group and a clean energy committee, and we've been having a lot of interesting times educating ourselves. One of the things SMPA does is provide green energy through this Green Blocks program. And if you're interested in buying green energy, and not necessarily solar panels, there's a sign-up sheet in back. There's no commitment. You can just sign up, and SMPA will contact you and give you information about what what it entails. But also, if you have questions about it, please let us know what they are, because we're turning to SMPA and trying to get them to educate us. So,
all right.
Thank you, guys.
Should be giving us a cut here.
Absolutely.
We're clearly not the Gypsy Swing Band, by the way. A night early, you're welcome to leave now. No offense taken. We are in every way not a Gypsy Swing Band. Thank you for that introduction. As you were saying, we are Evolved Energy Research, a recently formed consulting company, basically focused on the long-term energy transformation associated with deep decarbonization, and we'll get into sort of how we define deep decarbonization as the presentation goes along. We're also part of the organization called the U.S. Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, which was really sort of the umbrella research team that this work was initially conducted under. I'm nominally the head of that, though I feel like a puppet regime, and my mentor is now the head of the UN DDPP, and he pulls the puppet strings for me. Ryan does even more than code, Dave. He's raised a very multi-talented son. Sometimes we let him out of his office, and I'll actually let him start the presentation. Cool. Thanks, Ben. So, next slide. Hopefully this is visible, but
this is the least visible slide probably,
yeah,
so it gets better from here.
Yeah. So 3 questions tonight that we're gonna look at together as a group. The first, just to kind of set the stage where we're at. We're gonna look at kind of what global current emissions rates are and what the emissions budget is, just to kind of give the context for our work. After that, we're going to talk about deep decarbonization. What is it? Is it possible? And and our answer to that is yes. And kind of given that, what is the pathway? What does the transition strategy look like, going from where we are today to where we need to be in 2050? Is the kind of main focus of our research in terms of future years. Next slide. So this figure right here shows gigatons of CO2 emissions, starting way back in 1880 until about 1950. Land use change was actually the kind of the dominant net CO2 emitter on the
force on the planet. And you can see since that point, fossil fuels have really kind of taken off, and now worldwide we're at about 35 gigatons of CO2 emissions per year. Next slide. So these labels are not very visible, but here at the top, this is actually the U.S. And then EU is here, China. We've got the rest of the world and India down there at the bottom. And this shows per capita CO2 emissions rates. So this is tons of CO2 per person per year. And so this is where the U.S. is currently at about 17.4 tons per person per year. And that blue line down there at the bottom shows kind of where we need to be in terms of annual emissions per capita in the year 2050 if we are going to reach our targets for the Paris Accords and to have a chance at a 2 degrees Celsius world, which is really the kind of climate scientists recommend 2 degrees because of all the very dire predictions that come from warming beyond that. So that's the context. Next slide. So this is another slightly depressing piece of news here.
It's
So
like the saddest accounting problem in the world, basically, is what climate change is.
yeah, so this gray bar here on the left is the cumulative emissions budget that we had starting pre-industrial for a 2 degree world. So we can emit up to 3,670 gigatons of CO2 and have kind of a better than even odds chance of staying below 2 degrees Celsius warming. The green bars there in the middle basically show what we've emitted thus far. So, to this point, we've used about 75% of our total emissions budget, and at the current rate at which we're going, we have about 20 years left, right, before we use up that blue piece. Next slide. And this shows for the 4 largest emitters, China, India, the EU lumped together, and the US, this shows the commitments that thus far have been made internationally. 2014, that's where basically historical to the left, and then looking out after 2014, those are the commitments out to 2030. And what's clear from this is we're not well, here we're not leaving any room, right, for any any other country on the planet to emit. But that black line there also shows, that's a sample 2 degrees Celsius pathway, and so the total emissions basically need to stay under that all the way down. So it's clear that there's a lot to be optimistic about what's currently happening, but there is a pretty large gap between the commitments that have been made and where we need to go. Next slide. Okay, so what does this all mean? What it means is that we need a total redesign of our energy system, and that's the focus of Ben and I's work. And we call this deep decarbonization. So in the U.S., that is nominally a goal of 80% net CO2 emissions reductions by the year 2050. And that's that going from 17 tons per capita down to 1.7 tons per capita. So I'm going to turn it over to Ben now to tell us how we're going to get there. Yeah.
How long you got? It was a real depressing start to this.
Yeah.
Right. Go a little lower. Here we go. Next slide, please. Yeah, so one way we think we can get there is by modeling, and that's what we'll talk about, basically sort of examining the transition. It's really effectively an exercise in visualization. So if we know that effectively we have to apply non-linear changes to our energy system, right? You're not going to just draw a straight line down from 17 tons per capita to 1.7. We're not probably as a country going to be okay with using a tenth of the energy services we do now. We have certain expectations of modern life, and it's not really going to be satisfied just by using less energy. So how do you basically redesign that energy system to meet all those services while also achieving the goals that Ryan just so ambitiously set out for us at the beginning of this talk? So next slide. So a little background on what the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project was, and really what role it played specifically in the Paris Agreement. So the idea was really that the international process had been, for years, plagued effectively by the idea that the way to do it was a top-down global mandate, and countries would all adhere to that global mandate, and we would all sort of usher ourselves into the future energy economy. Obviously that met huge amounts of international political constraints, and so we've basically been deadlocked for 25 years at this point. So the new strategy was basically to employ bottom-up approaches, and this is an example of that. So the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, consortium of 16 research teams representing 75% of current global emissions. So basically all of the big emitters. So China was part of this, India was part of this, we were part of this as the US. These were not government-affiliated teams. So you have to remember that those INDCs that Ryan was talking about earlier were actually national government commitments to reduce emissions. And when you make a national commitment on an international stage, that really means something. And so it was important that our research wasn't tied to that, because that would have basically made us adhere to the same political constraints that those INDCs adhere to and sort of disrupt the whole process. So what this is really, it really is a research effort. We're not proclaiming that this is exactly what countries will do, but effectively through this research we've been able to achieve certain political aims in addition to some of our research results. So the overall goal was changing it from incrementalism to transformation. So every way that we have talked about mitigation up till now has been really focused on marginal effects and incremental efforts. So anytime you hear dollars per ton, something like that, the idea is that you do something marginal on the current system, you save a small amount of CO2, potentially costs a little bit more money, potentially saves a little money, and then that's $1 per ton of CO2. What that doesn't really tell you, and what that isn't really an effective strategy to do, is give you a visualization of what a future energy system would actually have to look like. And when you perform that visualization, that energy system provides people a window to see opportunities. It means that it's not so scary. It means that the arguments aren't framed in terms of costs, that there can actually be benefits that go along with transforming our energy economy, and that the whole exercise is not an exercise in just affixing cost to energy and making it more expensive and then just us somehow magically reducing those emissions. It will result in a physical system if we achieve this, right? It will look like something. We will be able to see wind turbines, we'll be able to see solar power plants, we will drive electric cars. And that visualization is really powerful, not only for policymakers who are sort of just in the dark about what this would actually really entail, but businesses. They don't necessarily know the scale of markets that may be transformed. PV is an example of something that's taken off precipitously in the last few years, that in our model takes off like 10x, 100x what it is right now, and people don't have that conception of what an energy system would actually have to scale like. So that's sort of an important point in our work. So we move from those policy abstractions to more of a problem-solving approach, and that pragmatic approach is really actually trickled down even into the negotiations. We want to go from opaqueness to transparency. Really, a lot of the negotiations up till now have been not misinformed, just uninformed, right? Nobody knows what cards the other countries are playing, and on this international stage, what that's resulted in is effectively gridlock. And we think analysis can play an important role in basically facilitating those negotiations. And the other thing is we want to move from conventional wisdom to concreteness. So, one of the things you always hear is that to achieve these mitigation goals, we have to have a carbon price. Okay, we have to have a carbon price, we have to have a carbon price, but a carbon price doesn't look like anything. I mean, it's a policy prescription, but what will that actually result in? What is the energy system that will beget, right? And that's the kind of thing that we were interested in. Again, back to the visualization effort. So next slide. And we don't want to pat ourselves on the back because I think we probably were a much more minor part than we're going to make this slide seem, but we did get, the DEPP more broadly, did get language into the Paris Agreement that said that all parties to the agreement should strive to formulate and communicate long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies. That should's a really important word, actually. It was days of negotiation, changing that from shall to should. Some of the inside baseball in those negotiations is both interesting and depressing. Like, apparently all of the text is just brackets, and they fill it in with words after hours and hours of negotiation. So the woman on the left, Minister Toubiana, was the Minister of Climate Change for France. She and Jeffrey Sachs were the two people who started the Deep Decarbonization Pathways project. She moved to the Ministry of Climate Change in France and was really the inside voice to push effectively that language into the agreement, because we think basically by developing these long-term strategies, it makes it seem real. It provides momentum within countries to actually achieve some of these things. And so we were really excited when we saw that language. And this photo on the left is not photoshopped. That actually did say decarbonize on the Eiffel Tower. It may be photoshopped, but decarbonize was there. Next slide. So this research that we've been discussing, the reports are available in all of their technical detail. Maybe skim some of them. They're pretty dense, but I think some of the high-level messages are really important. So the technical report we released in November of 2014, and that really answered on a really granular technical basis what it looks like, basically, and we'll get into exactly what it looks like. So is it technically feasible? What would it cost? And what physical changes are required? And then in November, we tried to translate those physical results into effectively policy guidance, because we thought the connection basically between our analysis and policy hadn't been made strongly enough. And so what are the policy implications for the US? And that was a report that came out in November. And the research was conducted by a team from our old consulting company, E3, along with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and Pacific Northwest National Lab and UC Berkeley, more broadly. Ryan was showing global emissions. So what does 80% reduction look like in the US? This is an abstraction. This is not what our energy system looks like, but this is our bogey, right? This is our 80% reduction. So right now, it's about 2,000 million metric tons of CO2 from the electric power industry. A lot of that is coal. Transportation, gasoline and diesel, a lot in light-duty vehicle travel. We have huge cars and we drive them all over the place. That really keeps being reverberated when I see analyses from other countries. We really do have the biggest cars and we drive them more than anyone. So our transportation sector is a huge source of emissions. And then there's industry, agriculture, and then commercial and residential direct emissions. So your furnace, your water heater. And then the important point to note is that we also have a sink in this country. So basically our forest regrowth is giving us a little bit of breathing room. So as a forest regrows and absorbs carbon, that means about 1,000 or 1 billion metric tons of carbon a year is netted out, which is nice for us. And that's actually a sticking point in negotiation sometimes with other countries, like how much you get to take credit for that and all those things. But we really focused in this analysis on the energy sector emissions, and the target again was 1.7 tons per person from basically our baseline of 17 today. Next slide. So how did we look at the energy system and in what detail? So we built a model. That's what we do. That's what we've been doing as consultants. And so the model we built basically looks at every piece of infrastructure in the U.S. energy economy that either produces energy, converts energy, delivers energy, or consumes energy. So for everything from coal power plants to water heaters to light bulbs to coffee makers to dehumidifiers to furnace fans, we have basically census division granularity on all those pieces of equipment. So it's a big model, lots of detail. It hasn't improved how good I am at parties. It's really not that fun to talk about in a social setting. 80 demand sectors and 20 supply sectors. It's an annual model. So really one of the principles of energy sector transformation is, yes, it would be great if we could turn over the energy system in a day, right? But it doesn't work like that. We buy equipment, it has a lifetime. We don't just scrap it because it doesn't meet our emissions targets. And so we have to adhere to that constraint that we don't roll these things over effectively until they break. So you don't get a new water heater until you need one. We don't do early retirement. And so to do that, you need a big stock rollover model, and you need an annual look so that you can see, in this case it would be vehicles. You can see that even if by 2035 every vehicle sold is either an EV or a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, you still have the problem of your equipment stock not actually completely turning over even by 2050, right? So you have that lag in terms of your equipment stock, and that's a really important principle. It's a really important component of our modeling. And the final point to make is we have an electricity dispatch model. So moving forward, the electricity sector changes more than any sector has to in the first place, but there are also just fundamental changes in the electricity sector that come with effectively losing control of your supply, right? So right now we have a fixed electricity demand and we dispatch power plants, right? We turn them on or off to meet that electricity demand, but in the future we basically don't have control over when the sun shines and the wind blows, right? And so there are fundamental changes you have to make to your electricity sector, and to model that we have an electricity dispatch model that is really cool, and is kind of one of the unique aspects of our analysis. So next slide. So moving quickly through this, just sort of how our model works. So basically you have a stock of equipment. Those technologies have efficiencies, they have costs, and they are trying to meet an energy service demand. So an energy service demand is something like vehicle miles traveled or kilolumen hours. So just the illumination in this building here is an energy service demand, right? And to meet those, we use those technologies, those have efficiencies, and that results in an energy demand from our, in this case, lighting. And the reason you see a precipitous decline is that's LEDs. And LEDs are great. LEDs are one of the technologies that we use every time, and we're very excited about LEDs. We also have heat pumps. Anything else we have a particular affinity for? No. Next slide. So at this point in the presentation, maybe we'll pause for a second and answer any of the skeptics who are wondering why you're modeling to 2050. Sort of what's the practical value of that? It's a heck of a long way off. Well, one of the things, and one of the reasons I was harping on the stock rollover, is that because your equipment has long lifetimes, decisions you make today have impacts all the way out to 2050, right? So power plants are a great example. If you install a power plant today, that thing can run in 2050, and so it's going to have basically mitigation impacts. So really you have to be thinking effectively in the long term when you're making decisions today, because there are pathways where it seems like we're going along, we're reducing emissions commensurate with our goals, and then we dead end, right? So one of the classic examples if we transition our whole electricity sector from coal to natural gas, right? So we go from coal, we go to natural gas, it reduces emissions today, it's great, but by 2030, 2035, we can't run that natural gas, it's too many emissions, and then we have to replace that, right? And so though that would be something like a pathway B, where you basically dead end. So that's really the practical value of looking all the way out, is charting a transition strategy where you don't make those poor decisions and effectively result in dead ends. So next slide. So now we're going to get into imagining a deeply decarbonized U.S., what that looks like for the energy sector and consumers of that energy as well. So next slide. Okay, so when we're designing scenarios to meet the U.S.'s energy needs in 2050, we have to know what those energy needs are, right? And one way we do that is with just projections of things that are basically macroeconomic drivers, right? How many people we have affects how much energy we use. What our GDP is affects how much energy we use. How much industrial activity we have changes how much energy we use, and the service demands we have on our energy system. So we have basically projections for all of those. We use the energy service demand that comes out of the EIA. EIA is the US's basically Energy Information Administration. They do long-term projections. They do long-term projections that don't look like ours. They look like long straight lines drawn out to 2050. They actually have a modeling platform that can't reduce emissions effectively this low, but those are basically the official government projections, right? So we also, when we're imagining the energy system, are not inclined to use technologies that we can't see today. Basically, the line I've used is that any technology in our model, you can put a hard hat on and you can go out in the field and see, either in pilot stage or just commercial stage. You don't need a hard hat for every technology. We have lights in our model, but you can see everything, and that's important, right? Because these are really easy problems to solve with technologies nobody has invented, right? And like, if fusion happens tomorrow, and it won't, by the way, I'm not a technologist, but I can assure you of that, it'll always be 15 years away, probably. Then this problem gets a lot easier. We're out of a job. We don't really need a complicated model. It'll just happen organically. But that's not a very interesting sort of case, right? Because that's an easy case to say, okay, it's just because you invented technologies, and that's just an argument for inaction, basically, to wait for a technological breakthrough. And there's actually context to the reason why I'm harping on this point, because basically recently Bill Gates has put billions of dollars, I believe, towards a clean energy breakthrough, because basically he says commercial technologies aren't enough. And I think we would express a pretty fundamental disagreement with that. We're not against technological progress. It's going to help. Every cost decline is going to help. The cost of PV coming down is going to help. When EVs are cheaper, it's really going to help. But we don't need to wait. We don't need to wait on a miracle. And there basically is no miracle. Our energy sector is basically way too heterogeneous to think of any technology solving its entire problem. But that's a little bit of a digression. And the final point is environmental limits. So this is also an easy problem to solve if you invent huge amounts of biomass that can be burned without emissions consequences. It's an easier problem to solve if you think that every river can be dammed and we can use that energy. So these are just ways we've made really the problem harder and more realistic in our case, because the energy economy isn't just like a technological representation, right? It's a political economy. And so if we choose to dam all the rivers, that's one thing to do. We don't want to make that our assumption basically in our scenario. So that's another constraint we applied. So next slide. So 5 key elements of low carbon energy systems. So hundreds of technologies in our models, but the way they interact, there are really 5 key elements to any scenario that meets these types of targets. One, What's your electricity mix? There are different ways to decarbonize the electricity sector to the extent that we've looked at here. We're not proponents of any single one. All of them have pluses and minuses, both economically, technically, and socially. But what's the mix that you basically arrive at in terms of renewables, nuclear, and fossil fuels with CCS in electricity generation is important components. The second,
CCS.
oh, sorry, yeah. I can't believe that's the first acronym I haven't explained. That's something of a record. CCS is carbon capture and sequestration. So you still burn the fossil fuel, it emits CO2, but we capture it from the smokestack and we put it in the ground. So that's CCS. Biomass supply and use, again, how much biomass you have makes the problem easier, because if you can make fuels out of bioenergy, then we can maybe just drop them into our current fuel usage. So you swap out diesel for biodiesel, something like that. The third component is carbon capture and sequestration, and you decide if it's really feasible and where it should be applied. The fourth component is electricity balancing. So this is the problem I was speaking to earlier, where you don't control your supply of electricity anymore. So how do you balance the demand for electricity with the supply of electricity? So if the wind's blowing at night and you don't actually have enough native electricity load, everyone's asleep, we don't really need it, what do you do with that excess electricity? And what's the technology mix you apply to basically solve that balancing problem? And finally, fuel switching. So there is no scenario where we can just drop in magical fuels to the sort of fuel types we use now. So we can't replace gasoline with ethanol, replace diesel with biodiesel, replace natural gas with biogas, at least with the amount of biomass that we anticipate. And so you really need to transition some of those end uses, like light-duty vehicle travel, to electrification. So we really need to be driving EVs, basically EVs or fuel cell vehicles, something that's powered by wind, solar, nuclear, and not gasoline. Next slide. So one takeaway, we built 4 scenarios, but there are 3 components that don't change. We call these the 3 pillars. So these are sort of the robust results of our analysis. 1, we have to use energy more efficiently. That shouldn't be that hard considering how inefficiently we use energy right now. Specifically in light-duty vehicle travel, basically the efficiency goes up about 10x by the time you transition to electricity in vehicles. Internal combustion engines are effectively like an abomination to me at this point. Doing all this modeling, I think you've probably noticed that by now. It's a theme. The second component of the 3 pillars is decarbonization of electricity. There's no way around it. There aren't mitigation scenarios where you don't decarbonize the electricity sector. There aren't decarbonization scenarios in our analysis where we even have coal in any real amount. And actually, we don't have any coal. It's just really playing in the crowd here. And finally, end use fuel switching to electric sources. Electricity is the easiest thing to decarbonize as an energy source, and so we really need to move our consumption into electricity so we can access those decarbonized energy sources. Next slide. So this chart shows you 2014 emissions, 2050 emissions if we basically do exactly what we do now, just bigger and the same, not better really at all. And then the 4 cases on the right, we have labeled the 2050 mixed, the 2050 high renewables, the 2050 high nuclear, and the 2050 high CCS. So we've labeled those by the primary electricity generation in the cases, but these are really different systems that we've built. We'll speak to some of the differences here in a second, but the real point is that there are 4 scenarios that we've built. There are thousands of scenarios that have differences, some large, some small. There are multitudes of pathways. We don't have one way. So if anyone tells you that sort of there's only one way to do it, that's that's not a technical argument. That's potentially like a political economy argument. That's potentially a social argument, but it isn't a technical argument. You can do it a lot of different ways, and we're just demonstrating 4 basically. And we can achieve that with increasing energy system costs under very conservative assumptions to basically anywhere from actually reducing costs by 2% of the 2050, or 0.2% of the 2050 GDP, and increasing about 1.8% under sort of the most dire prognostications of technology progress. So on average, it's about 1% of GDP. To give you some context, the US spends about 7% of GDP right now on energy. In all of our scenarios, that actually declines as a percentage of GDP. So in this future scenario, we're actually under what we spend now. So if someone makes the argument that it's unaffordable, that the economy couldn't sort of weather this, first think of the scale and then think of sort of the actual impact on that scale. We only spend 7% of our entire GDP on energy, and this would be 1% of that, so, or 1% of the total. Next slide. So how do these cases look different? Sorry, this is probably really small text, especially for people in the back. I apologize. And I may break the cardinal rule of reading off of PowerPoint slides and just read these to you. But going left to right, our high renewable scenario, it's about 70% renewables, so it isn't 100% renewables. There are reasons for that in terms of our current infrastructure and in terms of sort of how renewables act on the grid. You could have higher renewables at potentially a higher cost, but this is just our demonstrated case. We wouldn't say you couldn't have 100% renewables, but we would say you probably shouldn't technically. You can have really, really high percentage of renewables, but the last sort of couple percentage points of increments really isn't worth it from an emissions perspective, and we can discuss why if anyone would like to get into that. We have fuel strategies. So we actually, in the high renewables case, we actually decarbonize the pipeline. So right now the pipeline delivers not basically 100% natural gas. In our scenarios, it actually delivers a lot of biogas and fuels made out of electricity. Our main transport fuel in the renewables case is electricity. We have some pipeline gas and we have a little bit of fossil diesel, but this is really the light duty vehicle story and the transition to electricity. And then finally, this is the actual component of the pipeline. I may not go through all of these. If anyone sees anything on here that's surprising, maybe this would be an opportunity to say something. If not, I don't know how these slides will be made available, but it's a little in the weeds.
What's FCV?
Sure, fuel cell vehicles. Yeah. So really, the competition in light duty vehicles is battery electric versus fuel cells. So Toyota is bullish on fuel cells. That's where they're going. A lot of other automakers are going towards electric vehicles, so direct electrification. There are pluses and minuses to each that if anyone would like to discuss, we could do that. But really, the principal takeaway is that we basically have to use electricity to power our light duty vehicle transportation.
Fuel cell is hydrogen?
Hydrogen, right, yeah.
And so are you, the scenario, are you suggesting mixed? Or, I mean, when you're looking at these 4 categories, are you recommending one of those?
So we aren't. Our main takeaway is that there are multiple options, and that was as much a sort of political stance as anything else. Basically, it's really easy for analyses like these to get dismissed if they don't represent a certain constituency's like pet technology. So if you don't have a technology that has nuclear in it, then you're dismissed as wackos. If you don't have renewables, then you're dismissed as sort of in the pocket of nuclear and CCS. If you don't have CCS, it's similar to nuclear. So basically what we're saying is that these pathways are robust against technological options. The real thing that we should be focused on is how we're eventually going to decide and where these things will actually shake out. So when I keep saying fuel cell vehicles versus electric vehicles, that's the interesting result, sort of not that we think EVs are better or we think fuel cell vehicles are better. It's that there are competitions, that these are basically robust against technological failure, because I mean, some of these are not scaled, right? I mean, we sell EVs, but we don't sell them in the number that we're anticipating, right? And so we're trying to build these to basically be robust, so that components of each could be included in an eventual scenario, because these are really corner points. The eventual pathway, if we achieve it, is probably a mix of even these.
So what is PHEV?
Plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So they basically have an electric range and then a gasoline backup. Maybe next slide. Okay, so here's a visualization of our current energy system. This may look complicated, but the next one's more complicated, so I'm going to call it simple. It's simple in the sense that all of our energy comes from fossil fuels, more or less, right? I mean, if you look at the petroleum, coal, and natural gas bar, they dominate our primary energy sources. Petroleum goes to refineries, goes to liquid fuels, goes to our vehicles. It's a really simple transaction. Coal goes to electricity, goes to our buildings and industry. Natural gas is burned both in buildings and industry and in electricity. And then we have the spattering of renewables and some nuclear. But it's a relatively simple system actually in comparison. So if we go to the next slide, we've shaken it up a little bit. One thing you'll notice is electricity got a lot bigger. So that's the point I've been making, that electricity is effectively paramount as a delivery system for decarbonized energy. You'll notice that our sources of primary energy have changed. So we have a lot of renewables, wind, solar, even more, some small hydro basically expansion, and we have biomass. We have a lot less natural gas. We have no coal. Can I get a few more claps? Yeah. I'm pandering now. I'm really pandering. And then we just have a little bit of petroleum, which is basically some heavy-duty vehicles still use petroleum. It's effectively a premium fuel at that point instead of the way we use it now. But you'll notice that it gets a little bit more complicated in the middle as we're making some fuels out of electricity. So we're making power to gas. So that's turning electricity into hydrogen and then affixing CO2 to it and turning it into methane and then injecting it into the pipeline. So you can see the components of this have gotten a little bit more complex. So the energy sector is really, really interconnected by 2050. It's not very siloed. Everything really runs through the electricity sector. And you'll also notice, hopefully, that we're using less final energy than we do today.
Is geothermal, I saw geothermal earlier and it seemed like it was a larger component, but now I see that it's maybe very
That may be a scale issue. I think we basically maintain the amount of geothermal. I love geothermal. If there was more geothermal, I'd be, yeah. Geothermal is one of those things I love. Heat pumps, geothermal, LED, EVs, yeah. So yeah, we're definitely not anti-geothermal. Next slide. So we've talked about most of these, but in doing this for the US, we came up with some novel solutions when we looked at it basically as a system. So one of the things is we use electricity to produce these synthetic fuels that we need to decarbonize certain areas of our economy. So we produce hydrogen, we produce synthetic methane. The natural gas pipeline is decarbonized. So right now, again, it delivers totally fossil energy. In the future, it's going to deliver basically a mix of fossil and non-fossil. We actually replace liquid fossil fuels with that decarbonized gas. And finally, we don't use biomass in our light-duty vehicles. So the ethanol story is not a story we're interested in telling. It's first of all inefficient, and second of all, it's going into our gasoline tanks when we shouldn't have gasoline tanks, basically is the story. That should already be electrified. So that is something that's pretty robust as a result too. Okay, next slide. So you might be interested in what the electricity sector looks like, and if you are, then you're probably frustrated you can't read those legends. Top is solar, and then next down is wind. We've color-coded these somewhat intuitively. Then we've got hydro, we've got nuclear, we've got CCS, and then you see fossil, which started as the dominant component in 2014. By 2050 is very small. And that really is only basically running as backup power. So when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine, you have to run some of your fossil generation that exists, and so you have some emissions, but it's very, very small. And so this is our mixed case. Our renewables case would be obviously higher renewables. Our nuclear would have a larger component of nuclear. And so really we wanted to demonstrate that there are operable electricity systems that use all of the types of decarbonized generation that proponents say are the only type, and can basically deliver electricity in a similar way that we get it today. Next slide. And the only way we basically are able to achieve that in terms of decarbonizing the electricity sector is adhering to the rule that everything you install has a lifetime. That's an economic rule, but it's really a political rule too. Straining assets is really unpopular. So if you put a power plant in, it's more than likely going to exist for the rest of its economic life. It's really tough to retire that. So when we're making decisions about what we want our electricity sector to look like, we have to think of what we want our electricity sector to look like for 35, 40 years. So that power plant, you get one shot at it before 2050, basically. So if they want to build a power plant tomorrow, that needs to really be consistent with a decarbonization story, or we're already behind the 8 ball. That goes for everything with a long life. Some things have longer lives, and some things are more lives, and some things are more important. But if you put in a building today, if you build a house, unless it's a really ugly house, it's probably going to exist in 2050. If you put an industrial boiler in, there's some likelihood that it could be there in 2050. Our light-duty vehicle fleet is going to turn over basically twice from now to 2050. So we don't. The real message here is that we don't have much time. I keep saying 2050. It's 2015. That feels like a long way away. But we have nowhere near the time that 35 years implies. It really is it really compels us to action now. That's a pretty robust part of our results as well. Next slide. And so I talked about the fact that it'll affect costs to some extent, but the really more interesting story is how it affects costs, like how we pay for energy, how that changes. So right now, we spend a ton of money at the pump, right? And we spend a ton of money on the fossil fuels that either heat our homes, heat our water, or are used to generate our electricity. Moving forward in a decarbonized system, the costs may increase, they may stay basically the same, but the structure of those costs change a lot. So instead of paying money at the pump, you basically have a slightly larger car payment on your EV, but you don't really pay much in energy because it's so efficient, right? And where now we pay a power plant when it's burning natural gas or coal, we pay for that actual primary energy. When we build a solar power plant, we don't pay for that, right? It's an investment in capital. And so the structure changes a lot. So we invest much more in equipment, we build better infrastructure, and we pay a lot less in variable costs. So you can see in this chart, effectively you pay for the whole package by how much you save in gasoline and diesel. We've been paying that bill for so long we don't even realize it, but that basically pays for the transition of the energy economy, and that's how we maintain costs at the point that we do. So everything below the line is basically fossil fuel savings. Everything above the line is any incremental cost and equipment on the demand side. So if we have heat pump water heaters or things of that nature, they may cost a little more. They save us a lot in fossil fuels. And yeah, that story plays out in terms of saving variable costs and spending on capital infrastructure sort of across the economy. And that's a really positive story for the economy. So we've actually used these results to populate what they call a macroeconomic model. It assesses jobs and effect on GDP. And with our scenarios, it's basically a positive, net positive for jobs and a net positive for GDP. And that's a result of the fact that we are investing so much more in infrastructure and not spending as much on fossil fuels. So what does that look like at the home? Basically the same story. So this graph here shows the cost sort of within the home. So you have your equipment costs. You pay a slight premium for more efficient, potentially electrified equipment. You pay a little bit more for electricity, but you save a lot on home fossil fuel costs. So I actually don't know how homes are heated here. What's the standard? Gas. So yeah, the gas bill would go way down. In the Northeast, they wouldn't be paying for fuel oil, and so that's how that sort of cost would net. And then for vehicles, we pay slightly more for our vehicles. We have to pay the electricity, but look how much money we save in gasoline. So that's a net positive for transportation. We actually spend less on transportation. So next slide. That was actually the sort of last content slide, but we wanted to give some acknowledgements. A lot of these slides were created when we were working in our former consulting company, so we wanted to acknowledge them, and we wanted to thank Jim Williams, who we mentioned earlier, who's the head of the UN DEPP, my mentor, and the puppet master. So we want to thank him for his support. And we also want to thank you for coming out. This was really exciting for us to give this talk.
I have a question.
Yeah, are we, yeah, let's do, yeah.
Sorry, dive right in.
Yeah.
Have you guys researched carbon sequestration in soils? In other words, not capturing from power plants, but direct sequestration by looking at industrial agriculture in a more forward-thinking way?
Yeah, actually, so there's a project in Marin that's actually investigating soil sequestration, and we are talking to them to develop basically a pathways type approach, so like a long-term approach that sort of starts in 2050 and understands the scale that sequestration could achieve if you basically do it correctly, transformation of that. So yeah, we're talking to a research group at Berkeley that's doing just that. We're not experts in that, but I think there is interest in the amount of mitigation that could achieve, certainly.
There's a guy named Courtney White. His organization is called the Quibera Corporation, or
Okay.
Quibera Coalition. Definitely fascinating guy who's really doing some great stuff on that.
Yeah, as little as we know of energy, like the non-energy mitigation is even a greener field in terms of research. So there's a lot of exciting stuff happening in that area.
You guys mentioned a little bit about the macroeconomic model. This is a significant change. This would represent, massive economic growth. Reinventing fire, Andrew Lovering, he talks about $5 trillion. Have you guys done any research to kind of, match those numbers, or is that something you agree with? Because building better buildings, solar, it's wind, it's massive.
Yeah, the amount of investment basically that needs to be just slightly redirected, right? Like that goes from potentially a gas water heater to an electric heat pump water heater is in the tens of trillions, certainly. And the macroeconomic benefits could be substantial.
So is that what will drive this? I mean, obviously, we don't want to go above 2 degrees. That would really hurt us. But economically, we're sort of driven by that as Americans, Westerners. So is that a compelling argument in terms of what you guys are putting forward?
Yes, I mean, I think it is to some people. I think basically you have to make different arguments to different people. That is a very compelling argument to me. That's been a very compelling argument to people we've made it to. And it also just sort of buttresses other people's arguments. Like, basically, what we found is that we have to use different arguments for different audiences, but they're more receptive to arguments themselves than we would expect. I think, like, there's a growing realization that this has to happen, where we no longer really have our head in the sand, excuse me. That doesn't go for everyone, but I've noticed it even in the last couple of years.
Yeah, one positive or kind of a slide that sometimes we show has to do with the correlation between oil or fossil fuel price spikes and then kind of the macroeconomic impacts. So actually, if you look back over the last 40 years, you see a lot of correlation between when the economy actually goes through pretty big recessions, and preceding it, oftentimes you've got some type of fossil fuel, sharp escalation in price. So moving away from that variable cost also, even if, say, the cost of electricity goes up slightly because of wind and solar, maybe it's on average slightly cheaper. Moving away from that
Variability,
that variability also, because that variability has its own economic cost associated with it.
Yeah, something, I believe we're sitting around 7, I think, in terms of how much we spend on energy as a percentage of our GDP. I think during the oil crisis, it was something like 13. Like, that's what hamstrings an economy, not committing to spending potentially half a percentage higher and being certain of it, right?
When solar prices have come down, do we have hope that will drive some of this, or what's going to happen to fossil fuel prices as we do this?
Yeah, so predicting fossil fuel prices is like the energy analyst equivalent of like throwing darts blindfolded. I don't know what it is, but the real thing is eventually and we've seen it with coal, that if you start that transition and if we stop using gasoline, right, and we use less gasoline than we have before, right, every increment of gasoline that we use less means effectively less political power vested in the oil industry. And there's a transformation inherent in that in the political economy, that if we reduce our reliance on them as our energy supply, that a lot of things become more possible. Like, if we used half the gasoline we do now and half the diesel, then you could make a much more compelling political argument that, like, you no longer have a license to drill, right? Like, but as long as we're relying on them for the share of our final energy that we are right now, then we're really kind of at their mercy. I do think the technology costs we model had to be conservative because we're researchers, but I have a lot of hope that we'll look like idiots in 20 years, right? I think that we will. I think that if we were doing this 15 years ago, we'd have solar costs like in the $10. So I mean, it would just be insane. So
Yeah, I guess just on that point, a lot of companies that we work with have way more optimistic technological assumptions than we show here. Google, for instance, we've done quite a bit of work with them over the last 2 years, and they always lament the solar prices, for instance, that we use, because they're always 3 years out of date, which is in the solar industry basically means 50% too high. And that definitely, because this is a United Nations kind of set of analysis, we're forced to rely on public sources for all this stuff, so we're not always able to get the latest and greatest in kind of commercial prices for some of these cutting edge technologies. but yeah, there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic.
It's
there.
harder to be dismissed if you're saying, yeah, but we use like public source solar costs, right? We're not technology optimists in here, and it's still not expensive, right? Sorry, we don't know.
You describe a rather sobering future as far as the lag time with carbon-intensive energy sources. And then you mentioned or showed a 55% CCS in the future.
Mm-hmm.
I was under the impression that that was kind of a non-starter. Is that actually realistic?
Can you repeat that question just so everybody can hear?
Sure. So the question basically was about the percentage of CCS in our CCS case, whether that was realistic. From an infrastructure stock roller perspective, it's realistic. Whether they can meet those cost and performance estimates in our public sources, I think it's an open question just because it hasn't scaled to that extent. I know a lot of people are not bullish on CCS. But we wanted to basically represent it as an option to see what an energy system would look like with it. But yeah, I don't know that I would necessarily put my bet on CCS.
Yeah, it's definitely not our personal favorites, but there was an important kind of political argument to have that case in there. I mean, my personal opinion is that CCS is actually just going to get their lunch taken on cost for a lot of these renewable sources. So, I think it's just going to turn out to be the wind and solar turn out to be much cheaper in the balance. And I think that, and so, CCS fundamentally is it's not a very complicated technology, but it's a technology which has an immense scale, and there's a large cost associated with that scale. So that's the crux of it.
For electric cars in the near term, are the researchers paying attention to what kind of power plant would be running the electric car? So for example, in Boulder, Colorado, if you drive an electric car, you're just making the coal plant there run harder. So are they paying attention to that?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I guess there's really two answers to that. I mean, the first is that yes, you do have to, in some sense, pay attention to the timing of these of different measures coming in together. So, electric vehicles, obviously, you don't get the biggest bang for the buck until you also decarbonize your electricity system. That said, given the amount of time that we have, and also the amount of learning that needs to happen in the electric vehicle industry, on balance, even if you buy an electric car today is run mostly on fossil energy, that's still probably, from the perspective of deep decarbonization, a good investment to make if you're able to do that. But certainly, there are a lot of things that need to happen in concert here. And as Ben was saying, electricity is really the crux of all of this. So for all these things that we electrify, including that heating in your homes, your electric vehicles, et cetera, these pretty large sources of energy, we certainly get a lot further when we push harder on the electricity sector early.
In creating these models, did you also factor in the forecasted effects of the already changing climate and how that might impact our energy use?
We did, to some extent, how it affected our air conditioning use and heating use comparatively. There's a bit of a trend basically baked into AEL that it keeps getting warmer, so we need more AC, and we need less heat. But that was really the isolated impact that we measured. But there are others.
Exxon does it, so.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a huge cost that we don't talk about and don't show here, which is the cost of inaction, or even just the cost of climate change in the 2 degree C target that we're trying to shoot for. So, those are very hard costs to to really study and nail down. And typically when those studies happen, there's a very narrow scope of, they look at like human health impacts or years of lost life or something very kind of narrow that they can try to put some type of economic value to. But so what we're showing is kind of energy costs, but there's obviously a huge cost associated with not doing something.
Yeah, I mean, we like the system just for the energy benefits, but for the mitigation benefits, sort of if everyone's doing this and we actually achieve mitigation, like that's a whole side of the ledger we're not even looking at, and then you're not quibbling about 0.5% of GDP either way, really.
Does your model include a per capita increase in terms of energy by 2050, or just the same amount as we have now, or less?
It's a per capita decrease in energy use, but it's a per capita increase in energy services. So because we got more efficient, we can demand more of our energy sector, but we don't actually use more energy.
What role does education about conservation practices and so forth play in your model?
So that's like one of the winners that we don't model because we're trying to be conservative, but that helps, right? We didn't model it because it's one of the ways you get dismissed. They say, yes, but that's just because you're conserving energy, and how do we even do that? You're changing lifestyles, right? It's the sweaters and candles scenario. You never want to be put in that box as a researcher. So we didn't model that, but that's like one of those wins. Technology costs come down. We are more conscious about our energy use, so we use less. That all of those help, right?
Yeah, it seems to me there are some things, part of the pathway can be accomplished by individual action, but a lot of it can't. Did you take a look in terms of the different pathways at the degree of government policy change or government intervention that would be required to get there? Is there one pathway that requires less and relies more on market forces?
I think, in our understanding of the energy economy, there isn't that large a dichotomy between market forces and government, in the sense that that regulation and that regulation of competition is important in all of our scenarios. It's just a matter of how we do it. I think we identify policy changes that would need to be enacted everywhere we look, because our policy is almost wholly inconsistent with decarbonization. But it isn't a one ring to rule them all policy. It isn't necessarily a carbon tax. It isn't necessarily a cap and trade. It's like the smaller things, right? It's building codes and standards, or it's wholesale electricity market reform, or it's NEM, or things like that. That there are basically ways that we can align existing government policies with the idea of deep decarbonization. I don't know that one lends itself any more to the other than the other to sort of a pure market forces. Do you? I mean, maybe CCS requires the least amount of government intervention because it most looks like the system we have today, right? Like, it looks like our system, except we capture the CO2 at the smokestack. It comes imbued with all of the negative externalities that our system has, other than CO2, right? Air pollution, the fact that we import porn, all of those things are still problems in that scenario. It just produces CO2. But that's like the drop-in scenario. It doesn't look that different.
So I'm curious about one of the slides that you showed with 2015 and then 2050, and you showed nuclear as it stands now.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how many nuclear plants is that showing now? And then I noticed that it gets quite large. So what is the 2015? How many nuclear power plants, and then how many in 2050, based on that slide?
Yeah, so in that mixed case, which does have a pretty large increase in nuclear, I believe it's a doubling of nuclear capacity. So what we have today times 2. So a lot. And there's not a lot of momentum for nuclear right now. So this is sort of the demonstrative scenario, right? If we had to handicap things, nuclear is probably not going to be scaled to that extent. We did locate that for regional preferences, so we don't have a ton of nuclear power plants in California, right? California's not building nuclear power plants, they're retiring the ones they have. The South has sort of demonstrated some proclivity for building nuclear for various reasons, but we basically locate a lot of those in places that have nuclear now, like Texas or the South Atlantic, or the places that seem like they would even be willing to consider it, basically.
The marriage of electric vehicles and alternative sources like wind and solar seems ideal because each car becomes a storage unit, and that's a great way to capture it. But there's still this great deficit in terms of the capacity to store renewables and make them more attractive. So how does that play out in the future, do you think?
Yeah, so this is gonna be the nerdiest answer I give all night. So electricity balancing is like the reason I wanted to build this model, because it's really interesting. We have a really cool electricity dispatch model. We dispatch those EVs. So like you said, those have batteries, they have inherent storage. We can move our demand for that electricity around in time. We can do that for water heaters. We can do that even for space heating. There's thermal mass in our homes. So we have flexible loads in buildings. We have EVs. We have pumped hydro storage. We have battery storage. But we also have the ability, basically right now, all of our demand is must serve. So if I want electricity, I have to dispatch a power plant to meet that demand, right? In the future, it's a mix of demand that you have to serve at every point in time, and some demand that's just really flexible. So when we talk about hydrogen electrolysis or synthetic methane, those are loads that only turn on when we have too much wind or when we have too much solar. They're basically economic agents that say, okay, you're gonna dump this on the ground effectively, we'll turn on, we'll produce a fuel, that will fuel our vehicles, right? And we'll sell that, and that's the economic calculus they'll make. And so what effectively you do is you just build more renewables than you need to meet your fixed demand, and then your demand that can operate flexibly balances that surplus out, or deficit out, so, yeah.
Just one other piece about kind of the operability of the power system in this scenario. So, as Ben showed on one of the last slides, the mix of energy coming from various sources, we have a very small amount coming from fossil resources in terms of energy. The amount of fossil capacity that we still have on the system is actually higher. So in electricity consulting speak, this is your capacity factor, which is basically the kind of percent of your total potential energy that you could have created. How much of that are you actually creating? And so it's essentially how often you're running. And so these power plants, they're sitting there. They still may be needed for backup for different times of the year. I mean, there's also a kind of a seasonal imbalance that comes from very high renewable scenarios. But they might only run 5 or 10% of the year. And so we're paying a cost there in terms of keeping those power plants going, or keeping that kind of fixed capital asset around. We just don't run them very much. But that's one way that this system can still kind of meet the service level that we expect today, right? Which is you go and you turn the light on and the light comes on.
So a lot of that great load balancing technology, it kind of depends on smart grid being everywhere, like those kind of technologies. Do you have like a forecast for when that might be accomplished in the US? Like versus from the test beds to like everywhere would have that kind of thing?
We think probably the technology will outpace the market in the sense that like our ability to integrate those into our wholesale electricity markets is sort of at a very nascent stage right now. we don't particularly worry about the technology companies, but yeah, we'd have to roll all those technologies into the water heater stock, for example, right? We're pretty conservative about how much of the water heater stock we say can operate flexibly and how much sort of range you're willing to operate flexibly. Like we don't do a week of flexibility from clothes drying or clothes washing or things like that. But yeah, it has to adhere to the same logic.
In regards to pulling all this technology off, it seems like it's going to take a major consciousness shift. You know, right now we've got gridlock and a lot of willful blindness with people as far as the subjects that you're discussing. Where do you see, how do you see us making the shift from where we are now, consciousness-wise, to where we need to be to deal with all this topic?
Well, that's just about the hardest question I've ever had. I'm going to run my modeling back to you.
Well, yeah, I'll just say one thing, which is from a political perspective, I think probably what's likely is we reach, and I don't know if this is a year from now or 5 years from now, or we reach kind of a tipping point. So I mean, right now, you know, climate change is very much a partisan issue, and there's a huge divide there. And you know, I don't know that Republicans are ever going to, you know, the Republicans in Congress are going to embrace what we're showing here, kind of, you know, anytime real soon. But I think that argument of like climate change is not happening, it's not a real thing, we don't need to do anything, I think we will actually see that change relatively quickly. At a certain point after that, it just kind of gets more and more ridiculous. And so hopefully that is like hopefully we're seeing it close to its, you know, most divisive, you know, and then you know, maybe things happen more rapidly.
I don't know why I think they're
I'll take the hint on this one and pass it to
Can I just make a comment?
Yeah, please.
I've been involved in ecology for 43 years now, and when I started, the first 6 months of school had to do with reading Wendell Berry and Aldo Leopold, and what I'm seeing right now is a lot of people from Pope to Thich Nhat Hanh to Native American leaders coming from a different place. It has to do with spiritual ecology. It has to do with our deep connection to the earth. What drives every person in this room is their heart. Our hearts vibrate, as far as HeartMath says, 60 times greater than our minds, our brain does. So, at least for me, being involved in this for that amount of time, all my focus right now as far as study is going into spiritual ecology, because it seems that if we can change the belief systems and the energy that people have within themselves, we'll be able to pull off some of the technology.
So Ben, can you incorporate that in your model?
You just stole my joke. You actually stole my joke.
You don't have a chart?
Yeah, I mean, my answer seems so horrible after everything you just said. I appreciate what you said. Yeah, I think from my perspective, it may be much more sort of mercenary than what's been described so far. Just in the sense that, like, I think we get a couple of really big technology wins. I think solar is a really big technology win. That's being deployed, blue states, red states. I think EVs, potentially vehicle automation, are a game changer in light duty auto travel. And suddenly we start to be able to visualize the future energy system, and companies and industries get on board with that. And then the U.S. intransigence is basically operating in direct conflict with its economic interests. So I think the rest of the world can push us in a lot of ways. If they're serious about it, then our businesses are going to be serious about it in terms of markets, and that means our politicians will eventually be serious about it. if nothing changes, right? I mean, that's the logic of it currently. So I think honestly, we may start to get a lot of momentum without. There might be a push and not just a pull for this, basically. So.
Well, aren't there a number of major corporations and another Department of Defense is actually incorporating assumptions about climate change into their long-range plans? So that sort of thing is happening even in major corporations.
Yes.
And I think one of the latest stories I heard was even Exxon has been doing this for a number of years,
Yeah.
although they wouldn't admit it publicly.
Yes. Yeah, I think the business community demonstrated in Paris that they're taking it more seriously than they ever have, certainly. And you know, that's sort of a circular argument. They take it seriously, policy takes it seriously, business takes it seriously. You know, those reinforce each other.
So I think you said that most of your modeling was done on readily available technologies right now.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see any, like potentially the Tesla house battery, do you see any like that are really close that will help with this?
So the thing that I always say that could be the biggest game changer to make this the easiest is actually vehicle automation technology, just in terms of how it changes the economic calculus for an electric vehicle. That's the one I would pick if I could pick. I don't know. Do you have a different one?
Well, just to, it's kind of the self-driving cars, the same, I think we both agree there. Just to kind of give some intuition for why that changes the economics so much. I mean, the average taxi today in the US drives 75,000 miles a year. And so when you have a vehicle, so under a kind of a heavy automation scenario where you have transportation as a service rather than a vehicle that people purchase, especially people who live in cities, you see a much more rapid turnover of vehicles, so it's a lot easier to kind of have rapid integration of EVs. So that's the first piece, but the second piece is that operationally an electric vehicle is already way cheaper than a gas vehicle today. And so if you can compress those fuel savings into 3 years, then all of a sudden the additional upfront cost of the EV is not as burdensome. So if you were say an Uber that was running self-driving cars as a service in a city, which who knows, maybe we see that in 10 years, 15 years, electric vehicles will actually be a cheaper way to go than fossil fuels, even just with today's technology. So that's why that one in particular I think is particularly kind of, we see a lot of promise there.
Now that I've heard how fantastic your thinking is,
Yeah.
I'm really curious, how connected are you to the policymakers and companies, corporations, and discussing this?
So the real genesis of this work, this DDPP, is a science paper that Jim Williams, who we referenced, wrote for California in 2012. He was analyzing their 2020 GHG target, realized that basically everyone in the room thought the world ended in 2020 in the sense that like they weren't looking past that to do energy planning. He built a model, so that's what we do. He built a model of California, and that model eventually is how Jeffrey Sachs started the DDPP. That paper sort of was the genesis of that. But that paper is also the reason why he's talked to the governor. Our former consulting company was actually the company that was informing the state's GHG target setting. So the analysis underpinning the 40% reduction by 2030, which is on the path to 2050, the 80% reduction by 2050 path, was actually analysis that we did. That was one of my original models. Did that analysis for California. So we're specifically plugged in California. We've done a lot of briefings at DOE, at FERC, the State Department. In terms of businesses, we can say some and we can't say some, but I would say on the whole they're taking it very seriously, and because they're taking it very seriously, we're getting an audience, which I am happy about for multiple reasons, but really in terms of changing people's thinking is really the primary one.
So just, if you could explain where you guys go to next, you're probably not gonna keep doing slideshows year after year. What happens with this project now?
Yeah, so we have developed an open source version of this model, and the idea basically is that that model can be transported to various jurisdictions globally, effectively. I mean, we want to go to cities, we want to go to other states, we want to go to other countries, because we think there's basically a power in even having done the pathways analysis, bringing all the stakeholders of an energy system together, making them add up their claims. You know, this is basically an accounting tool, and it's really easy to sort of hide the ball when you're making sort of prognostications about energy, but it's also really nice when you can sort of fact check those, and as a way of organizing the process of planning in an energy system, we find this pathways approach is really helpful. So really we're trying to basically spread the gospel of pathways in a lot of ways to different areas, and we have some projects coming up to do that.
You got anything else you want to do?
Well,
other than spreading the gospel of the world?
I was just going to say we're probably just going to keep doing PowerPoint presentations.
Yeah,
I mean, I kind of saw my
a few
life.
more towns that might be open to it.
Yeah.
The next phase.
Yeah, I can speak to the. Yeah, the DDPP in some ways sort of accomplished its mission in COP, but I think the focus moving forward is to really transition the conversation away from proof of concept of these to more implementation. How do these inform what we actually do? Because I think there's a lot of usefulness there. So basically, all these research teams are going to take their analyses, they're going to try to deploy them sort of within country to decision makers and hopefully influence the trajectories of their own energy systems. But really that language in the original, in that language I showed in one of the original slides in terms of getting into the Paris Agreement means that there's going to be effectively a demand for these types of analyses because that's what the GOP is asking for. So we're really excited about that phase, basically, where this transitions from research really into government policymaking, because there's kind of a timeline that we've seen in California from research to policymaking that we'd like to basically connect the dots in multiple places.
So is that something that you see as different about the DDPP as opposed to some of the work that's been done in the past, like Paul Hawkins' work and Amarillo? DDPP has inroads to already viable inroads?
Yeah, a lot of these research teams participated in the commitments made for 2030, so they have that. They do have that connection. Yes, I think that these were the appropriate level of research, but they were plugged in enough to policy that they'll be able to make that transition relatively smoothly, or at least policy guidance.
A very local kind of bring it home question. So what can the average person in this room do to help, other than buy an EV vehicle, right, to move this forward? Because one of the things that I'm passionate about right now in the North Fork, just up the road, there is still a lease going on to do some more coal mining in roadless areas. And to me, that's like unconscionable. I just don't understand how that can even be happening now. So, you know, as citizens, the average person, how can we help make this happen?
Yeah, I mean, to the extent the energy system is a political economy, I mean, while there may be some economic calculus that makes sense to mine coal there, like the political economy really is where that may get shut down earlier. And so, I mean, I don't know if I'm in a position to sort of propose activism, but that would make sense. It's harder to mine coal if it's harder politically to mine coal, right? I mean, they're not just making economic calculations, and really, one of the reasons why coal is to decline so precipitously is, yes, they lost economic power because natural gas got cheaper, but as soon as they lost it, everyone realized they didn't really like the coal industry. In a lot of ways, I think that will play out as we transition away from some of these sources. And that transition happened way faster than anyone anticipated. Obviously, that's what the bankruptcies are about. So, yeah, I think reminding people that there are reasons we don't like these industries past even some of the mitigation concerns is important.
I think maybe we should thank these guys for coming and giving us I'm sure they're happy to keep talking. And I happen to know they're working all weekend on a proposal for another project.